Viewer discretion is advised.
Glenn Taylor made his fortune in the printing industry, which isn't a dying medium or anything. Before he bought the Timberwolves in 1995, Taylor was a Republican senator in the Minnesota Senate. What's more shocking about that to me is there are actually Republicans in Minnesota. Minnesota T-Wolves. The team players leave like a psycho ex-girlfriend. I wonder why nobody wants to play in Minnesota. Here's a short list off the top of my head of players who left Target Land and won championships. KG, KL, Chauncey Billups, and let's of course bring up the 2009 NBA draft where you took Ricky Rubio and Johnny Flynn with back-to-back first-round picks but passed on Steph Curry. Ooh, that has to. Dear Minnesota Timberwolves, not even max money for 4 years can keep me in this shithole. I'm out. Signed, Jimmy Butler. Minnesota Timberwolves. The T-Wolves have had a rough existence, passing on Steph Curry twice, watching stars walk from the bitter cold to enjoy success, and never really getting off the ground in Minneapolis. Of course, getting the hell out of Minnesota for greener pastures has kind of always been a thing. Ask the Lakers. And so in 30 years as a franchise, the T-Wolves have only made the playoffs a paltry 9 times, and then only won 1/3 of their games once they got into the playoffs. 20 of their 30 seasons have been sub 500. Just a lowly, pathetic existence for a team that nobody wants to play for. Sometimes a season never gets off the ground, and the 2014-2015 T-Wolves never even got out of the hangar. In the 8th game of the year, the Pelicans flambéed the Beta Dogs. Anthony Davis led the charge with 22 points, 4 boards, 3 assists, 2 steals, and 2 blocks. 3 Pelicans had 12 or more points off the bench, and even Jimmer Fredette played. The T-Wolves would suffer a 15-game losing streak later and finish with 16 wins on the season. With a name that sounds like a mid-90s indie band, Crunch the Wolf is known for his ferocious dunks. According to the team, he was born in the Minnesota wilderness and played ball on a makeshift pine cone and birch bark net. Once the T-Wolves came to town, well, Crunch had to say goodbye to the wilderness, and the rest is history. I think Robin Lopez came with him the same year. Reminds me of another epic tale where a young wolf takes on a bunch of scrubs and makes them look ridiculous. First arena to have a green roof. Yes, that is grass you see growing on top of the Target Center. I mean, can they grow corn up there too while they're at it? Not many exciting details about this arena other than it's always been named the Target Center, and the LFL's Minnesota Valkyrie used to play there. And finally, our most cheatingest moment from the most unlikely team. 4 years after drafting Joe Smith #1, the T-Wolves curiously signed him to a 1-year, $1.75 million deal. The Warriors had offered the 23-year-old $80 million. This was weird. Turns out the Wolves had an under-the-table agreement to sign Smith to 3 consecutive 1-year deals and then offer him a mega contract of $86 million. David Stern found out about this and punished the Wolves severely, taking 3 first-round draft picks. The whole thing sounds really stupid. Like, what if Joe Smith got hurt? I mean, how did he fall for that? But as they say, cheaters never win. Well, unless it's tampering. With the worst attendance prior to the season getting suspended, you guys should be right at home when they have to play games with no fans in the crowd. Maybe if you did have fans, one would have pointed out that Jordan Bell's shirt was untucked earlier this year and you wouldn't have lost due to a delay of game. Man, CP3 is a snitch. Yeah, we all know you passed on Steph Curry twice, but in 2011 you whiffed on Kemba, Clay, and Kawhi for Derek Williams.
Crunch the Wolf, Minnesota. I like this guy. I think the outfit is cool and he seems approachable, but I am a little concerned with the smirk he has on his face. It seems like he could have some disturbing ulterior motives. Don't let your kids around him alone. Rating, 6 out of 10. Minnesota Timberwolves, Kevin Garnett. A pretty easy choice here. KG is far and away the best player the Timberwolves have ever had, and the only sort of playoff success they ever had happened with him leading the way. Now, to be fair, playoff success meant 2 playoff series wins in 13 1.5 years, but KG was saddled with some dog shit rosters in his prime, so he kinda gets a pass. He was a fantastic all-around player who won an MVP and a shitload of other awards during his time in the Twin Cities. His only real flaw was that he probably should have been even more selfish as a scorer, but hey, nobody's perfect, right? Well, except me, of course, but you already knew that. Minnesota Timberwolves, Johnny Flynn. Flynn will always be remembered most for being the guy the Timberwolves stupidly took over Steph Curry in 2009, despite already having taken a point guard in Ricky Rubio. Flynn actually had a somewhat respectable rookie year, but he declined quickly afterwards, lasting just 134 games with Minnesota before being traded. He would last just one more season afterwards in the NBA before playing overseas. Minnesota Timberwolves. It would be a shame if you blew up your future to acquire Rudy Gobert. Oh shit, you actually did it. What a bunch of idiots. And you didn't even trade away D'Angelo Russell, a guy who actively makes every team he plays for worse. Oh look, another protester just glued themselves to your home court. Kevin Garnett is far and away the best player this shit franchise has ever produced, but if we're being real, he was a fake tough guy and a mental midget in the playoffs. If he was truly as great as Tim Duncan, like his supporters say, he would have won more than 2 playoff series in 12 years.
In 2004, the Minnesota Timberwolves finally contended for an NBA championship, and the timing was perfect. Back in 1995, Minnesota executive Kevin McHale nailed it by drafting elite power forward prospect Kevin Garnett, then by hiring his friend Flip Saunders to coach the youngster. This is team owner Glenn Taylor. He didn't really help, he's just very rich. Anyway, even with a rising superstar and a well-regarded young coach, the Wolves did not win a playoff series through KG's first 8 seasons. But at last, in 2003, right before Garnett's record-setting contract was about to expire, McHale gave his centerpiece a squad worth sticking around for. Sam Cassell, an aging but tenacious point guard with championship experience who became a first-time All-Star in his first season assisting KG. Latrell Sprewell, another newcomer well into his 30s but still the perfect lively slasher to complement Garnett from the wing. Coach Saunders and his new Big Three had a decent supporting cast too, like bucket generator Wally Szczerbiak, and 2 late bloomers the Wolves had plucked from obscurity, point guard Troy Hudson and defensive specialist Trenton Hassel. Even though injuries depleted Minnesota's depth in 2004, the Big Three was enough to make a good team great. Garnett won his first league MVP, then led the franchise to its first playoff success, a decisive series victory over rookie Carmelo Anthony and the Denver Nuggets, then a grueling 7-game defeat of the dangerous Sacramento Kings, capped by a KG masterpiece. The parade of unprecedented success only stopped at the feet of the tough but foundering LA Lakers, who outlasted Minnesota in the 2004 Western Conference Finals. But LA would soon crumble, creating a Western Conference power vacuum. This freshly built Minnesota powerhouse looked ready to fill that vacuum and march even further than the conference finals in the years to come. Or Kevin Garnett's Wolves would never make it back to the playoffs. The surest thing coming out of the 2004 playoff run was Garnett. Before the season started, he had correctly assessed the team around him as top-notch and signed a 5-year, $100 million extension. This was Garnett's second huge contract. The preceding one, in its magnitude and timing, had helped drive away Garnett's initial co-stars. Young point guard Stephon Marbury felt undervalued and eventually pushed for a trade. Tom Gugliotta found the whole thing awkward and signed elsewhere. And one more thing from the past. In 2000, the Wolves got caught trying to circumvent the salary cap to pay free agent Joe Smith. The NBA penalized them by stripping a whole mess of future draft picks. These data points help explain why Garnett and Saunders didn't win a series until 2004. They may also inform our understanding of what happened after the playoff run in 2004. The 2004-2005 Wolves ran back basically the same roster that took them to the conference finals, but it wasn't quite that simple. Unrestricted free agent Troy Hudson came back only after a protracted negotiation. Restricted free agent Trenton Hassel had thrived during Wally Szczerbiak's extended injury absence and cashed in with a pretty substantial offer sheet from the Portland Trail Blazers. The Wolves opted to match it and keep Hassel. This was a lot of money to commit to breakout bench players. But Hudson and Hassel were more than just useful shooters and defenders, they were close with Garnett. Team owner Glenn Taylor would later put undue blame on them for capitalizing on that fact. It wasn't just free agents eager to cash in on the 04 success. Cassell and Sprewell, still under contract, were like, hey, we had big years, we're tight with Garnett, and we're his actual co-stars. We want big extensions. The Wolves looked at Cassell and saw a guy about to turn 35, coming off surgery for a hip injury that cost Minnesota dearly in the Western Conference Finals. They weren't going to pay up. Cassell skipped a bit of training camp to broadcast his displeasure before carrying on with the 2 years remaining on his deal. Sprewell was noisier. The Wolves did offer him an extension, but at about half his asking price. Sprewell went public with a now infamous quote, "Why would I want to help them win a title? They're not doing anything for me. I'm at risk. I have a lot of risk here. I've got my family to feed." That was an overreaction. And so predictably was the media response. Sprewell, like Cassell, entered camp without an extension. So the band was back together, but the pressure was on and the vibes were off. With everyone healthy now, Saunders had more minutes and egos to juggle. Zerbiak needed touches. Cassell and Hudson both needed minutes at point guard. Injuries had simplified Saunders' rotational choices the prior year. Now he regularly shuffled the starting lineup. Perhaps related, Saunders could not stir up the prior season's effort and organization on defense. What had been one of the league's most efficient defensive teams regressed to middle of the road. It's tricky to diagnose flagging performance from a relatively unchanged roster, but observers were quick to point fingers at Cassell and Sprewell, both still grumbling about their contracts, each producing measurably less than he had in his first year as a Wolf. Hudson had his nice new contract, but also new injuries and complaints. The frontcourt rotation around Garnett had been a weak spot even during the playoff success, and it remained a problem despite the addition of young Eddie Griffin. After a prolonged Cassell injury absence and a couple long losing streaks, the club coming off a 58-win season dipped below the 500 mark. Wally Zerbiak compared the slide to a bad dream. Wolves owner Glenn Taylor commanded his GM to do something to wake the Wolves up, so McHale fired the coach. Firing the coach is pretty typical of a team in regression, but this firing was particularly fraught. Flip Saunders was a Minnesota fixture. He'd been McHale's college teammate and Garnett's mentor since he was a teenager. This was a huge change. McHale made himself interim coach and got Minnesota back in the win column, but not enough. 2004's Western 1 seed fell short of the 2005 playoffs. Garnett's grouchy co-stars received most of the negative headlines, but the man in charge caught some blame too for bobbling off-season finances in a way that left everyone grouchy. In any event, 2005 would not be another run-it-back summer. McHale didn't want to do two jobs long-term, so he hired longtime Seattle assistant Dwayne Casey for his first NBA head coaching job. With his first lottery pick in a while, McHale drafted North Carolina's Rashad McCants. Not bad considering the options, though one of those options was future All-Star Danny Granger. Sprewell's contract expired, and the Wolves no longer wanted to keep him around. The new free agent got such unsatisfying offers from other teams that he eventually retired, just 1 season after refusing the Wolves' 3-year extension. So there went one crucial part of the best Wolves team ever, and McHale dealt away another. In August, Minnesota traded Cassell and a future pick to the Clippers for Marko Jaric, a young and promising but injury-prone lead guard. Just to play this one out, Jaric stayed healthy in Minnesota but was nowhere near the super versatile game-changer McHale promised. Meanwhile, the much older Cassell had a major bounce-back year and helped carry the Clippers to their first postseason success in forever. So Minnesota gave away the most productive player in the deal and a lottery-protected future pick, which would haunt the franchise until the protection actually ran out for the 2012 draft. Kind of a spoiler there, but yeah. McHale made the Cassell trade expecting the Wolves would get good again soon. They did not. It was a terrible trade. But at least the Wolves kicked ass in free agents. Nope. Their biggest new signing was noted draft bust Nicolas Skidishvili. I will go to my grave believing Skeeta could have been a good NBA player, but he was not, and Minnesota ditched him after he played 5 games. So yeah, the 05-06 Wolves were stinky doo-doo. With a rookie coach and stripped-down roster, their once-elite offensive production plummeted to match the sunken defense. But it took another deal to really sink the ship. In January, the Wolves joined in a big, ugly yard sale of a trade. The headline for the Wolves was losing Wally Szczerbiak, their only scorer besides Garnett, and acquiring Ricky Davis, who was a funnier, slightly worse version of Wally. A team that hovered around 500 before the 06 trade completely tanked after it. The Wolves' 33-49 season record was their worst since Garnett's youth. Every piece except the centerpiece had gotten shittier. But hey, all that losing bought the Wolves a high lottery pick, their best chance of grabbing Garnett a new young co-star. And with the 6th pick in the 2006 NBA draft, the Minnesota Timberwolves selected Brandon Roy, the soon-to-be Rookie of the Year, a future superstar guard, a terrific potential companion for KG. If only the Wolves hadn't preferred the far inferior Randy Foye. McHale was so set on dealing Roy for Foye that the Blazers were able to strong-arm the Wolves into trading with them. Roy helped lead a Blazers turnaround. Foye did not do that for Minnesota. He was fine. Once again, the Wolves started their season okay-ish, thanks to their lone star. Once again, the bottom fell out after a mid-season move. This time, it was McHale firing Casey and promoting Randy Whitman to head coach in January 2007. Minnesota was 20-20 on Casey's last day. They went 12-30 the rest of the way under Whitman. So back to the lottery, where the Wolves passed on future Defensive Player of the Year Joakim Noah for his smaller and worse Florida teammate, Corey Brewer. Granted, Noah would have been a funky fit alongside Garnett, but about that. Toward the end of the Wolves' losing season, McHale said the team did not plan to trade Garnett, but Minnesota knew KG could opt out of his contract after one more season, and they feared losing the best player in franchise history for nothing. By draft night 07, McHale had spent plenty of time on the phone discussing trades. A proposition complicated by Garnett's ability to scare off trade partners he didn't like simply by saying he wouldn't sign an extension with them. Garnett was most enthusiastic about a trade to the Phoenix Suns, a fun, talented squad in a city with much better weather than Minnesota's. There was also interest from the Lakers, who were trying to figure out a path forward with their own star, who wasn't happy. But McHale didn't want to deliver Garnett to a Western Conference rival, and especially not the Lakers, who he'd come to loathe back in the day as a Celtic. McHale got the furthest along in trade talks with, well, the Celtics, who were run by his old teammate, Danny Ainge. Ainge was willing to give up basically all of Boston's young players for KG, and McHale was into it, but Garnett was not. Right before the draft, agent Andy Miller made it very clear that his client would not sign an extension if traded to Boston. But things changed. Among other things, the Celtics traded for Ray Allen. Garnett wanted to contend, and a potential core of himself, Allen, and Paul Pierce sure sounded like a contender. In late July, Garnett agreed to commit to Boston long-term, and a deal was done. Garnett for this array of interesting young players and expiring contracts. To make room for this huge infusion of prospects, McHale waived Hudson and traded Hassel, the last vestiges of the great 03-04 team he'd built. Well, except Mark Madsen. He was still there. Oh, hi, Mark. Months after the big trade, Kevin Garnett became an NBA champion. Months after the big trade, the Timberwolves finished their worst season in a decade, and things would only get worse. None of the prospects Minnesota got back for Garnett panned out the way they hoped. Al Jefferson had some strong seasons before injuries slowed him down, and some other guys were fine, but that core never amounted to anything. Minnesota spent the next decade playing the lottery with mixed results. McHale swung a smart trade for rookie Kevin Love in 2008. McHale became coach again later that season, but this time relinquished his front office position. Before the 2009 draft, McHale got booted entirely after a lengthy Wolves career. And in the 2009 draft, new executive David Kahn blew his opportunity to secure Love a co-star. This image will haunt the Wolves forever. Even after that mistake, Minnesota enjoyed enough lottery luck, exciting hires, and big trade acquisitions to break through just like they had in 04. They, however, did not, for a lot of reasons. So this remained the franchise's peak. After over a decade of failed promise, this version of the Minnesota Timberwolves looked like a keeper. But the Wolves mishandled the keeping, and in dismantling their one and only contending roster, got the short end of every move, right up through the big one. That's how the era after a conference finals berth ends up looking a lot like the era before it. That is how a big ol' collapse happens.